I'm Sue Friedlander. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator of the Arkell Museum and Kennedy Library, which means I get to do a lot of really terrific things, one of which is to welcome people here along with my colleagues and thank you all for coming to this most wonderful event. It takes a village to do many things. It takes a village to do something like this. So I do want to especially give a shout out to our Library Director, Maria Cancro, and our Curator of Education and Public Education, Mary, who's carefully documenting the event in the back of the room, as well as our entire team and our entire board. Everyone works tirelessly and without complaining. So thank you all and thank them if you can. It is my pleasure to introduce our sponsors for this inaugural event, Julia Gleich and Jason Andrew, who will step up to the mic, and they will have the honor of telling you a little bit about the inspiration for this inaugural event, and then they will introduce today's speaker. So Julia, thank you again so very much. Little adjustment here. Okay.
Thank you. Very elegant. Well, I'm Julia Gleich, and I'm really excited to be here with my colleague Jason Andrew. And I'm thrilled to initiate this annual lecture series in honor of my mom, Elizabeth Hearn Gleich, at the Arkell Museum. My mom was about 4 years old when she moved with my grandparents, Martin Hearn and Marion Whitehead Hearn, to Canajoharie. My grandfather set up the Hearn Agency, which you can still see it down there on 5S. Same name. I was so surprised. So they lived above a car repair on Erie Boulevard, across from the high school and down the street from this library. My mom has fond memories of doing all sorts of kid stuff, playing in the park and in the fountain, and taking out books with my grandmama, and also running around the grounds with her dog Patches. My mom was an avid reader, and she still is. In 3rd grade, my mom was allowed to go to the library alone. Mrs. Gerard, the librarian, was tasked with making sure that the phone call was sent to my grandmother to let her know that my mom was on her way home. And you can imagine that it was a thrill discovering the world through this library. At the time, it was still very small. She loved looking at the Winslow Homer paintings, especially during summer vacation. She said the ocean spray views were a cool retreat from the hot pavement. She loved it here, though she did find the Rembrandt a bit scary. Later, I came to Canajoharie on visits to my grandfather and grandmothers, and they lived on 1 Front Street at the time. Of course, at that time, I was checking out the records in specifically Jesus Christ Superstar at that time. Small things can come in, big things can come in small packages. I just want to say that coming through Canajoharie and seeing the library grow was really exciting to me and very exciting to my mother. We put our heads together with Sue Friedlander after maybe a couple years supporting the library, Jason and I, and we came up with this idea to do this annual lecture, and so we are really excited about it. I want to thank also Kate and Amy, who traveled in for this special lecture, relatives of my mother, and me, of course. And this is the first, obviously, of many annual lectures to come, and I hope to see you at them. So, let me introduce William R. Cross. He's an independent scholar and a consultant to art and history museums. He served as the curator of Homer at the Beach, a marine painter's journey, 1869 to 1880, a nationally renowned 2019 exhibition on the formation of Winslow Homer as a marine painter. And he's just released this book, Winslow Homer, American Passage. Thank you for coming today.
Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Super, thanks. If at any point I fail to project, please raise your hand. thank you very much for that nice introduction, Julia, and Jason. Thank you for this brilliant idea of creating this inaugural lecture and a lecture series, an annual lecture in honor of your mom. And I have to say, even though your mom isn't here, I'm grateful to Liz for being the inspiration that she has been. And if she's been an inspiration to you, Julia, I know she's been an inspiration to others. This remarkable library and museum, I am very grateful for, even though I live far away, because I have seen how a little engine can create really some impressive results. And as an example of that, when the curator came from Madrid to bring the Museo Thysson's painting, owned by the Baroness Carmen Thyssa Bornemisza, but on display at the Museo Thyssen. When she brought it and it got to hang in 2019 next to the Arkell's painting on the beach, she was so thrilled, and so were all of us. And that would not have happened were it not for the generosity of this institution in lending that and 3 other works from this wonderful collection to that exhibition. So I feel very deeply indebted to the Arkell, and not only because of all the work it took for this day, to Mary and Sue and Maria in putting this together, but also for that history. And I also thank you for coming today. I normally speak for about 45 minutes with about 90 slides, and I had a real challenge. There are 126 slides I'm going to show you. And I don't know that I can do it in less than 55 minutes. So I'm going to beg for a little bit of patience as I work through the story of Winslow Homer's life with as many slides from the Arkell's collection as I could jam in without it being a real snooze fest. So thank you in advance for that charitable patience. So as Sue mentioned, or maybe Julia, maybe it was you who mentioned that I was curator of this show in 2019, when not one of us had ever heard of this thing called COVID. Boy, am I grateful that wasn't a year later. It was just focused on 11 years of Homer's life. But those 11 years, from his first marine painting, which I'll show you shortly, through the most productive period of his life, the summer of 1880, right before he went to England for the second time. So that period was an important period. And it included pictures so captivating, as in this centennial picture, so the same year as Tom Sawyer, created by his exact contemporary, Mark Twain, that they earned Homer's work deep and lasting affection across the whole country, which survives to this day. Such is the familiarity of some of Homer's paintings that even Americans who don't know his name often do know his work. As a biographer, my focus has been on Homer's life, within which his art has served as indispensable documentary evidence. In examining that life and the breadth of art Homer made, I hope that you may find resonance with other aspects of your own lives and times today, our own lives and times. Homer's story is rooted in his youth in Boston and Cambridge, and in his understanding of the tectonic forces which shaped our country, forged our country, before, during, and immediately after the Civil War. Born in Boston to parents immersed in seaborne trade, even as a child, Homer was keenly aware of the economic, social, and moral tensions roiling the country, ranging from the Panic of 1837, a year after his birth, and arguably the first global financial crisis, to accelerating antebellum division over the greatest moral question of the day, which was, of course, slavery. The house in which Homer was born in the waning years of the Jackson presidency is long since razed, but was set amid the clutter and stench of Boston's North End, adjacent to wharves where Homer's father, an aspiring but failed merchant inventor, sought in vain to find his fortune. The Boston Homer knew as a child was hub to trade with ports across the whole Atlantic world, beginning with the southern states of the US. Most importantly for the Homer family, Mobile, Alabama, where 3 of his 6 paternal uncles settled, 2 of them permanently. Exactly 1 year before Homer's birth, one of those uncles, whom he knew well, was shipwrecked on the Bahamian island of Eleuthera.
Mr. Cross?
Yes.
May I adjust that for you a little bit?
You can do whatever you would like to make it work.
Yeah. Okay. Speak right on.
All right, thank you. Is that better? Yes. Excellent, thank you. Years later, in 1885, he and his father would return to the site of that wreck on Eleuthera, as Homer first made pencil drawings and watercolors leading toward the Gulf Stream, perhaps his greatest picture, completed in the last decade of his life, and the linchpin of the exhibition conceived by the Metropolitan Museum, which has just reopened in London at the National Gallery, and is on there till January 8th if you're looking for an excuse to fly across the Atlantic. While his precocious older brother, Charlie, a brilliant chemist, attended Harvard, Winslow and his younger brother, Arthur, lived nearby and studied at Cambridge's Washington Grammar School. Winslow was a precocious draftsman and colorist, as you see, and seems to have dropped out to begin work by the summer of 1853, just after he turned 17. His boss was a Boston lithographer, John Henry Buford, whose downtown crossing workshop depended both on plentiful capital for presses and costly limestone blocks, and on plentiful labor. Buford hired apprentices for 3 purposes: to grind down the blocks, to draw appealing designs on them, and then to print the finished products, from sheet music to theater tickets to book illustrations. 2 of those 3 purposes, grinding and printing, required fewer brains than brawn. But the middle one, drawing in crayon on limestone, necessitated both long hours and delicate skill as a draftsman. The slender, reserved Homer had that skill and that dedication, and the encouragement of his mother, who was herself a talented amateur painter. About 9 months into his apprenticeship for Buford, another boy arrived in downtown Boston, not far from Homer's birthplace in the North End. This boy was similar in age to Homer, but from Virginia. His name, Anthony Burns, soon became famous, not only in Boston, but across the nation. Burns had escaped slavery by clambering aboard a ship bound for Boston. The man who claimed ownership of him hired a so-called slave catcher who abducted Burns and delivered him to a waiting U.S. Marshal on the courthouse steps. There, with the approval of Boston's mayor and the President of the United States, the young Burns was tried for violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. The brilliant oratory of his Harvard-trained counsel, Richard Henry Dana, who lived a stone's throw from Homer, failed to persuade the court. In chains, Burns was marched down State Street before the eyes of 50,000 people, fully 1/3 of Boston's population. The sight and the story were catalytic. Prosperous merchants, even in the textile industry, which depended on Southern cotton, would reflect, as one wrote, "We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs and waked up stark, mad abolitionists. The naked question emerged. In fulfilling the demand of the man who claimed he owned Burns, had the United States itself inflicted a crime, both against one teenage boy and against the core of its own ideals? Homer leaves us no documents telling us what he thought of Burns's trial or what he said of it to his neighbor, the lawyer Dana, author of 2 Years Before the Mast. But in 1856, as the nation's temperature continued to rise, he composed a lithograph depicting another act of violence, this time on the floor of the United States Senate. There, shortly after Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered his speech, "The Crime Against Kansas," Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, beat him. Across the print's top, Homer ran a quote from Brooklyn's Henry Ward Beecher, whose brother had been pastor to Winslow's mother at Boston's Park Street Church. "The symbol of the North is the pen. The symbol of the South is the bludgeon." And then Homer began designing wood engravings for illustrated newspapers, a medium which had been invented just 15 years earlier in London and had now come to America. His designs were distinctive in their rhythmic geometry, humor, and suspenseful narrative ambiguity. Making these prints was an even more collaborative process than lithography, as they required not only a skilled draftsman, such as Homer, working both on paper and on tightly grained wood blocks, but a second man, a wood engraver, who would complete the work by cutting into the block where Homer had drawn. That process converted the artist's two-dimensional design into a delicate relief, dependent entirely on the two men's shared skill in drawing line. The wood engraver's work was exacting and earned for him about the same amount the draftsman earned. At 23, Homer moved to New York, where several of Boston's other draftsmen had also moved, along with their wood engraver colleagues, and where, excepting field trips in the US and 2 long trips to Europe, Homer would live for the following 24 years, and would spend many weeks over the 27 years after that, during which he was legally established as a resident of Maine. New York offered far better education for ambitious artists than Boston did, and taught Homer a geometric discipline that remained with him all his life and is visible here, and at the end of his life, in this scored sketch, just 6 years before he died, he made this. You can see the precision of his artistic process, and we'll also see this in several of the watercolors. I'm sorry to say that the lines that show that this is in fact a scored sketch are almost totally invisible, but trust me, they're there. New York grounded Homer in a practice of shaping visual narrative that he deployed across each medium within which he worked, from painting on canvas or wove paper or ceramic tile, to designing wood engravings, to etching and lithography, and that remained core to his artistic methodology throughout his career. One example is this early watercolor in which Homer places himself with 2 actors, each a brook trout, just above their waterline. He is invisible, as we the viewers are, but still present, ushered together into an intimate drama. One trout has leapt, arced, clear out of its element. The unseen but expert fisherman has already acted. He first enraptured the fish with his blood-red fly, and then firmly hooked it. Now fully airborne, the trout takes center stage. It seeks to shake free of the fly and its promise of a sure demise, but also, unknowing, tangles with a second blue fly, hanging as a dropper at lower right. The behavior of both aquatic actors bears consequence to themselves and to one another. Homer leaves the destiny of the second trout a matter of suspense. He conjures a narrative of ambiguity in which the viewer places himself in empathy with this living creature on the cusp. Will it too perish? At 25, Homer had already found ways to direct his talent to tell a story without words, and even without visible human characters, and to compel his viewers to care about the outcome of his tale. By the time Homer made that watercolor, his countrymen were already at war, killing one another in the bloodiest conflict of our nation's history. The brash brothers who published the illustrated newspaper Harper's Weekly needed draftsmen with narrative skills, such as Homer possessed, and snapped up his designs. He bore witness to the everyday drama of war, the life of the ordinary foot soldier, not the general, offering complex but accessible compositions that connected men at the front to lives back home. He opens his narrative for the viewer to imagine the varied experiences of those men and to consider the outcomes of the stories Homer begins. In News from the War, for example, he tells a story of news traveling by letter, conversation, or even the sound of a bugle. He hangs 7 scenes from telegraph wires, tightly integrating them thematically and visually. The device pays sly homage to the university building on Washington Square, into which Homer himself had just moved, and where wires still dangled from the ceilings on which Samuel Morse had hung them 20 years earlier for his successful experiment inventing the telegraph. Homer could sell a design such as News from the War for about $100, the equivalent of $2,700 today. In those days, the value of an oil painting like this one was similar. But Homer aspired to become more than an illustrator. He wanted to be and to be known as a painter. And for that, he needed to paint. With his success designing illustrations of life in camp, he turned naturally to that same subject in his first canvases. Several such as this were ribald in character. The Last Goose at Yorktown, for example, was one of the first 2 oil paintings Homer ever exhibited, paired with a more meditative picture, Home Sweet Home. A man of few words, his titles were often as multivalent as his pictures. The subject of home permeated the Civil War for all those who had a stake in it. The enslaved who had no home, the Confederates who believed that only through secession could they retain their home, and the federal troops who fought ultimately for a larger mission, a reimagined home, an America anointed by God for his purposes. For most of each year, Homer's life in the 1860s and 1870s was an urban one, in which he was well aware of, for example, the conditions in which his most vulnerable neighbors lived, among whom were surely some whose own wartime experiences had shattered them for the rest of their lives. He made most of his income from the illustrations he could sell year-round, but he painted within a seasonal pattern. He and other painter friends traveled in the late spring and summer to scenic regions where they could make field sketches such as this. Although Homer was not eager to admit it, these men were also an essential source of artistic and commercial counsel to one another. He lived not in protean isolation, but within a social context. He and his peers returned in the fall to their New York studios to make oil paintings based on those sketches, and then endeavored to sell those pictures to deadlines the art market set. January through April was exhibition season. That was also the season for auctions, which, in the absence of the gallery system that developed in the 1870s, was an even more important method for exhibitions than exhibitions were for artists to sell their work. The seasonal pattern not only pulled Homer and his friends off the hot New York streets, but fostered their wider knowledge of the world. He would have agreed heartily with his exact contemporary, Samuel Clemens, who wrote that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. Many of Homer's fellow painters journeyed both to scenic locations around the Northeast and other parts of the country, and to Europe, where not long after the end of the Civil War, Homer also traveled. There he encountered far more paintings than he had been able to see in the US by Millet, whose Gleaners proved especially inspirational, Monet, here painting an American Civil War battle waged in waters off the French coast, Turner, and Whistler, who had just brought to London revelatory seascapes he'd made in Chile. Upon Homer's return from those 10 months in England and France, he settled back into the same seasonal pattern he shared with other aspiring painters, grounded for most of the year in his New York studio, but awaiting warm weather travel to more picturesque settings. And because the Arkell's collection is so strong, it invites us to travel with Winslow Homer to 6 sites around the Northeast, including in the late 1860s, Cape Ann, and its modest seaside village of Manchester, Massachusetts. Manchester is one of the scenic regions which Homer probably visited first, just briefly, with friends as an experiment, just as he also visited the White Mountains at about the same time. But what's significant about his initial foray to Cape Ann is that it set Homer on the path to begin the work for which today he is best known. One of the ironies of his career is that before 1869, this artist, now so closely associated with marine painting, had never made one. At 33, he exhibited his first oil of the sea, which he called Manchester Coast. The critics hated it, one writing that the most noticeable point appears to be the dashing of the ocean spray above the rocks, but as indicated by Mr. Homer, it resembles the work of a boy who has dashed a spitball upon a newly papered wall. The review exposed the critics' ample ignorance of Japanese prints, which had taught Homer not only how to paint droplets in motion at upper right, but other pictorial techniques such as a high horizon line, a contrast between the distant view and the exacting description of the foreground, and an asymmetrical compositional format that hazards a bit of viewer vertigo. He likely began the process of making his picture with this sketch of Singing Beach, Manchester's best recognized feature then and now. It's not especially different from how his predecessor, Fitzhenry Lane, had sketched the same subject from a similar vantage point just 4 years earlier. But Homer, unlike Lane, did not seek to replicate a cartographic reality. Instead, he said, when I have selected the thing carefully, I paint it exactly as it appears. That is, he considered his context deliberately, constructed his frame as precisely as he set the objects within it, and then, and only then, expressed what he observed. He distilled down his idea of the beach to these anodyne gulls and granite boulders, which of course could be anywhere along the shore. In selecting them for his picture, he challenged the viewers to find beauty in the unremarkable and to make meaning from it. Within the tightly framed composition that Homer set, he painted with exactitude particularities he pulled out of their usual context to convey their truthful appearance to him. In choosing Manchester Coast as his title, Homer acknowledged the legacy of his predecessors who had painted there and declared his intention to depart from their manner. The name is not descriptive, but elusive, entirely in keeping with his quirky temperament. course, Homer had to balance his instinct to innovate with his commercial reality, inasmuch as he painted for money and needed to. He sold his work in the present, or if he couldn't, simply moved on to the next project. With reviews such as this picture received, unfair though they were, it didn't sell. Homer never showed it again, and crated up as best he could, both this first marine work and the sting of its reception. But most importantly, he did not give up and stuck with marine painting. About the same time, he journeyed to another very different maritime destination, the bustling resort of Long Branch, New Jersey, which was easily accessible from both New York and Philadelphia. It was crowded both with adults and with children. The Arkell is privileged to own the larger of the two remnants of Homer's ambitious painting, Low Tide, the other belonging, as I said, to the Thyssen collection in Madrid. And the Baroness was generous enough to lend it to the exhibition I curated in 2019. Low Tide won critical reviews every bit as kind as those for Manchester Coast, which evidently led to Homer's taking his own knife to the canvas in disappointed pragmatism and making two pictures from one. Homer also journeyed to several rural locations in the Catskills, most importantly, Palinville, New York, where he painted the Arkell's rooster. The bird has a cousin at the Addison Gallery of American Art and comes from the same context and period as do several pictures related to small schoolhouses. I think it's fascinating that in both the Addison's picture and in the Arkell's oil painting, the rooster seems to have great intelligence, significantly more, I might add, than the lady in the background. It looks like she's a sister to the scarecrow. So the Arkell has an enchanting watercolor from that body of work, within which, of course, the best known picture is Snap the Whip, also from the Catskills. The year he completed this picture, Homer moved to the 10th Street Studio Building, a cultural hothouse where he lived and worked for 8 years until the spring of 1880. In 1873, surely encouraged by others at 10th Street, he returned to Cape Ann, journeying this time to the fishing port of Gloucester. By summer's end, Homer had produced enough work in a medium just then winning new respect, watercolor, that he was willing to display 10 sheets, albeit with such hesitation that he gave none of them titles or prices. Homer adhered to a consistent approach for the 25 watercolors which survive from his visit to Gloucester that summer. All focus on children at play, but not at leisure, as they prepare for the maritime work that awaits them. Each of the sheets from this first exhibited suite of watercolors is of similar size and appears to come from the same block of off-white wove paper. Homer completed his work in a horizontal format on all but 2 of the sheets, each composed, like his wood engravings, of stark geometric shapes. Also like his illustrations, the sheets embed a narrative ambiguity that draws his viewers into the stories Homer has begun, inviting their completion in the eyes and minds of those to whom he appeals. That ambiguity lies atop an undercurrent of fear and foreboding. Homer's visit coincided not only with the start of a deep depression lasting 7 years, but with an event that summer that was particularly significant for Gloucester, a catastrophic gale which swept up the Atlantic to assault the city and its people with unsparing, merciless force, decimating the commercial fishing fleet upon which Gloucester depended for more than 90% of its economy. Then, as now, the livelihood of fishermen depended on their taking mortal risk. Many of these watercolors focus, like this one, on the act of seeing, as Homer's models explore the world around them, including that part of the world which is submerged and warrants closer viewing, to which he also invites us. As these boys gaze into the shallows, they do not see what we see, a schooner destined for the rich but dangerous grounds of George's Bank, the gaping maws of the horse sheds beyond, and the scaffold-like derricks at right. But what do these boys see that we, in turn, cannot? Some of Homer's early watercolors reflect his affinity with black children. This instance, one of many, figures in contrast by posture and apparent motivation. In the Arkell's superb Contraband, Homer creates a daring pair expressing tender kinship across differences, old and young, black and white, scarred and innocent. His veteran is a zouave, proudly wearing over his worn jeans what parts of his regiment's uniform survive: his jacket, sash, and cap. Homer accentuates the intimacy of these two figures in this carefully constructed studio production by placing their knees tightly together at the vertical center line. The boy's small hand is placed exactly at the horizontal center line, atop the water canteen the man offers. As the two sit atop an ancient wooden beam, the boy's left big toe touches the toe of the soldier's left boot, a silent and grateful assent. It's noteworthy that Homer marked the centennial not only with breezing up, but with a pair of pictures featuring black models across a breadth of ages, some born into slavery and others born after emancipation, as well as a grandmotherly figure. Homer's younger characters this Sunday morning not only are at worship, but also are learning how to read. His eldest model looks out of the picture frame and into a complementary painting, which Homer sets in the same space and includes in it an evidently unwelcome character, the former mistress of the plantation on which Homer's black figures still live. His diptych-like pair, in which sentiment and tension coexist, is a classic example of Homer leading us into a purposefully open-ended drama. You know well the museum's beloved watercolor Moonlight, which Homer made the same summer as something I'm just about to show you, and inspired by the same place, East Hampton, at the end of Long Island. But this is a special portrait as well of an evocative figure who was the leader of the Montaukett people at the eastern tip of Long Island. Homer's empathy with indigenous women, men, and children, including those he painted later around Lake St. John in Quebec, suggests that he saw himself in them as outsiders making their way on soil and water they cherished, and which their ancestors had known for centuries. In the following 6 years, Homer's travels seem, with one exception, to have been entirely in New York State, especially to Houghton Farm, the Hudson Valley home of his patrons, Lucy and Lawson Valentine. There he focused on children at work and play in an Arcadian setting at odds with the gritty reality of farm life, but in keeping with the art market's demand for pictures evoking a guileless simplicity the Civil War robbed of all Americans. His shepherdesses seem to inhabit a space beyond time and place. Homer inscribed on this canvas a picture of value, and by contrast, placed it atop a second canvas, a somewhat rougher sketch, but still a finished picture, which he evidently determined not to exhibit. His other destination in upstate New York during this period of the mid and late 70s was the Adirondacks, site of perhaps his greatest upland painting, Two Guides. A young man, his red shirt embroidered with a heart, follows an older man's direction with his eye, but not his feet. This pair of figures strikes a contrast not only by age, but by height, personality, and meaning. The two men allude to polarities we all feel between our American itch and our longing for home. The one exception to Homer's self-enforced abstinence from salt water over the 6 years after 1874 was in 1875. That summer, he spent a month in Maine, making an abundance of drawings, including some that led to this depiction of an archetypal Maine fisherman seated on a double-ended fishing vessel that is distinctive to the Maine coast. Homer's return to the state, likely for the first time since his childhood, was prompted by love. His younger brother Arthur married Alice Patch of Lowell that June, and the couple decided to honeymoon at Prout's Neck, a dozen miles south of Portland. With an enthusiasm uncommon among honeymooners today, the young couple invited relatives, including Winslow, to visit. When 5 years later, in the summer of 1880, Homer returned to saltwater, it was to Gloucester, and with a sense of purpose, as he clearly had already planned a second trip to Europe, which he sought to finance through the sale of a large portfolio of his pictures. He knew his market well enough and knew himself well enough to work almost entirely in watercolor at astonishing speed. His summer's harvest was about 100 new watercolors. Homer lived with the lighthouse keeper and his family on 10-Pound Island in the middle of the harbor, immersed in the magical intersection of land, sea, and sky. His watercolors contrast strikingly with those he made 7 years earlier. The children who appear in these later Gloucester watercolors are at one with the rocks and rippled water across which they navigate. Their curiosity mirrors our own. Their joy in summer sun as natural as the smiles these scenes bring to us as we bask in their delight today. These boys seem utterly untroubled by the woes of the world, which hung over the children Homer painted 7 years earlier. Amidst these happy children, his 4 depictions of the Culinda, a sloop owned by his friend George Marsh, are unusual portraits of a vessel whose owner identified closely with her, even to the point of composing poetry in her honor. They are the complements to the careful depictions Homer made of his chum on his previous Gloucester summer of 1873, and now again of Marsh at the tiller in 1880. It seems likely that Homer did not intend these for the art market, but rather for friends, including Marsh himself. In the case of the Arkell sloop portrait, its first owner was the eminent poet, editor, and inventor, Edmund Clarence Stedman. Homer also experimented that summer in painting a series of dramatic sunsets, many of them with loose brushwork and an appearance of abstraction, until one looks more carefully at their compositions, which reflect Homer's characteristically disciplined geometric methodology. In this case, the returning schooner's bow just touches the vertical center line. The treetops of Gloucester's western shore beyond make a slight diagonal, balanced like a seesaw on the horizontal center line's midpoint. Homer's work of that long, productive summer of 1880 did in fact finance his second European trip, as he hoped it would. He spent 20 months in 1881 and 1882, primarily in the North Sea English fishing village of Cullercoats near Newcastle, where in a darker palette he made more ambitious, larger watercolors. His eye generally focused on the stolid women and children, who remained on shore as the men young enough to fish, their husbands, brothers, and fathers, journeyed out each day. And this is on exhibition in the gallery just behind me. Again, as is this. Again, he deployed a methodical, geometric compositional system that reflects Homer's discipline and faith in an underlying order that he developed in his youth and that sustained him throughout his career. While he was in England, his older brother, Charlie, financed their parents' purchase of a large chunk of Prout's Neck, where Arthur had honeymooned. Charlie also paid for the construction of a house there, including a studio on the second floor, clearly anticipating that Winslow, then 47 years old, would live and work under their parents' roof. The Homers called the new house the Ark. The family had developed a collective conviction that both Winslow and his parents needed to make decisive changes in their lives, and that relocating to Prout's would help to effectuate those changes. His mother, Henrietta, and father, Charles, had moved from Belmont, Massachusetts to Brooklyn 10 years earlier, but seemed never to have put down roots there. She, a Maine native, likely led the initiative to Prout's. Winslow agreed. His closest friends were migrating away from his base in Greenwich Village. By the early 1880s, he had established relationships with dealers who were able to represent his work well without his continued residency in New York. Like Winslow and their parents, his two brothers, one now resigned to be childless and the other raising his family in Galveston, saw Prout's as both place and program to maintain family unity, despite tensions that might otherwise prove centrifugal. Land at Prout's was cheap and little developed, primarily because fresh water was difficult to access, but also because the family which owned that land had gradually and was only then concluding that its highest use was not for farming, as the full occupancy of the next half dozen boarding houses and hotels demonstrated each summer. The Homers' plan, set in motion in the summer of 1882, ran into trouble almost immediately. Within months, Winslow concluded that he could not sleep and work cheek by jowl with his parents. He moved their newly constructed 1.5-story stable to the lot next door and hired their architect, John Calvin Stevens, to expand it as his home and studio. Second, the impetus for the family scheme, his mother, became gravely ill, and less than 20 months after breaking ground on the Ark, died. This left Winslow as the principal caregiver for his imperious widowed father. Despite Winslow's filial affection, managing the old man would prove a considerable challenge for another decade and a half. Winslow least enjoyed Prout's when his father, brothers, and other family members most enjoyed it. At first, Homer's years at Prout's were ones of staggering productivity. He focused for the first time in his paintings on the innate longing of all people for salvation, and on a theme that would engage him another 2 decades of mid-ocean wreck and rescue, due in part perhaps to stories he heard on the deck of the Cunard steamship Parthia on his way to England in March 1881. Just before his mother's death, he achieved a triumphant sale of this picture for the then staggering sum of $2,500, equal to more than $65,000 today. He also made his first trip to the tropics, traveling with his widowed father to the Bahamas the winter following Henrietta's death, and beginning a series of drawings and watercolors that are meditations on Southern peoples, places, and promises made and broken that led ultimately to the Gulf Stream, his monumental painting, upon which he continued to work for some 7 years after its first exhibition, as seen in the photograph of Homer in his studio with the picture in its original state. As mortal themes became central to Homer's work, he created the famous contrasting pendants of the herring net and the fog warning, in which he sets a fruitful harvest of small fish that a pair of men catch close to shore against an uncertain outcome, as a solitary figure pursues large fish far out at sea, at potential loss to his own life. At about the same time, Homer was working on another picture, smaller but no less ambitious, which reflects his continuing fascination with the art and science of seeing. It is a pictorial exploration of a single existential question: where are we? And on the role of systematic, and collaborative observation in answering such a question. In this context, Homer's interest in photography is especially relevant. This print from exactly the same period appears to be one of the first photographs that Homer made from one of at least 3 cameras that he owned. Winslow returned to Gloucester in the summer of 1885, probably to work on 8 Bells and another important picture that relates to the port. But another factor might have been that Prout's was especially noisy just then. His 9-year-old nephew was one agent for the eradication of quiet. But another was the construction project directly across the street from his home and studio. Amid, he wrote, much hammering. St. James Church is a pillar of the Prouts Neck community today, and Homer's recently wedded father was one of the founders. But Winslow himself is not documented ever to have worshipped there, or indeed anywhere else. He wrote his brother's wife that the church is of great value to the property, and doubtless as a music enthusiast loved the sounds blowing out the church windows and across the street. But his highly observant approach to all aspects of life had one exception: his formal religious practice. Surprisingly, as the structure of his community continued to take shape in the mid-1880s, in part through the recognition by others that Prouts Neck is indeed a fine place to create summer cottages, Homer's spirits inverted. The new church and the houses springing up did nothing to help. His period of immense productivity led to a slump that deepened to a depression. For 3 years, he painted almost nothing. His pivot was through returning in 1889 to the Adirondacks and to a farm he had visited twice in the 1870s, now the newly formed and rustic North Woods Club, of which he became a member. He would find there a welcome counterpoint to Prout's, making the long journey 19 times over the remaining 21 years of his life, for periods of a few days to 3 months. At and around the club, Homer found rest and a conviction that the words of his favorite author, an Anglo-Scots physician, were true. Everything bears the mark of order impressed upon it by the almighty hand. Homer's newfound delight in God's created world in which he immersed himself was as tangible as the trout he painted. He saw in awe the working out of an invisible but benevolent design. He probably held the contrarian view that in the Adirondacks, as one enthusiast wrote, with such symbols and manifestations of God around, you need not go to the lettered page to learn of him. The Bible with its print and paper is a hindrance rather than a help. The trout has sprung from the rippled, nurturing shallows for a brief moment, just as has their prey. Homer catches all of it in mysteriously ordered balance. The fish, the bug, the lily pads, and the air he too breathes. He relishes the suspense of the moment and its extreme brevity for the 3 characters in his drama. Upon his return to Prout's, he brought that same new engagement he had formed in the Adirondacks with the narrative in nature that awaited his witness. He had developed a deepened sense of purpose and meaning in how he responded to the unfolding stories he observed and how he expressed that response. In one of his first oil paintings after that catalytic summer of 1889, he grounded his drama through the eyes of a hunter at midwinter, in awe at the power of the pounding sea and the resilience of the craggy land on which and from which man and plant survive. The following year, he chose a woman's eyes, those of a neighbor, to convey that same tale through a disciplined palette that nevertheless demonstrates his ever-changing coastal vistas. And he found that in some Prout's Neck pictures, like those in the Adirondacks, he did not need human characters, as he placed in this picture, to convey a compelling narrative. His plot could hinge upon the rhythmic motion of the forces his own five senses observed. The damp touch of salt spray at left, the surprising sight of pink in the curling wave at center, and the thundering sound of the roller at right, are just three parts of an evanescent expression of another creator. It took many days of careful observation to get this, Homer wrote about one of his pictures, with a high sea and tide just right. His own creative process depended on his humility before the work of, as he would call him, the great architect. Homer maintained that same sense of patient awe as he witnessed the continuing drama of the created order through the cycles of season, sun, moon, tide, and storm. In most cases, he marked the human imprint on the land and sea in subtle but visible form, as in this case, and in his seascape whose competing forms of light from both the moon and Mr. Edison anticipate his bold Caribbean picture of 8 years later, Searchlight on a Harbor Entrance, Santiago de Cuba, one of only 2 tropical oil paintings he ever created. Art historians have suggested that in the last 2 decades of his life, Homer conducted a one-way transit towards abstraction, but in so doing, they overlooked both the role of narrative grounded in his long experience as an illustrator and the visible social context of his life that underpins his storyteller's instinct. Prout's, as an example, was not only rollers and rock, but buildings and the people who inhabited them. Like the structures in which they lived and the cliffs on which they stood, his brothers, father and nephews, and neighbors shared with Homer the continual experience of Maine weather that conveyed its own suspense, as he depicted over the remaining years of his life, such as in his late seascape, Early Morning After a Storm at Sea. The patterns of geometric order that he learned in his early 20s also remained with him through the last decade of his life, an order made manifest through his creators' continuing acts of creation and recreation. They invite our own observation, as do Homer's tributes to those natural phenomena, and his late dreamlike responses to them, including what is his most surreal and mysterious work, whose underlying narrative is as impenetrable as it is inescapable, undergirded by Homer's meticulous sense of geometric harmony. His sense of wonder did not mean that he was blind to vulnerability and depth, but rather that he believed in the sovereign hand that this side of heaven requires that we see through a glass darkly, in faith that one day we may see face to face. So in Homer's largest painting, Fox Hunt, it's not the ravenous crows with which he empathizes, but the tired old fox, as, like the fox, his own signature sinks into the snow. And this, too, is working out of an order that is observed and attended by the Almighty, who made all creatures. Homer presents a tragedy for us, but he does not give away its ending. And he too cares about all that he, the human creator, has brought to life. This painting was one of several that before his 60th birthday had won Homer a reputation for work whose visual significance to our culture is comparable to the contributions that Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and Mark Twain made to American literature. Despite the recognition his work received, Homer's life changed little. Over all that life, in his close observation, his skillful hand, idiosyncratic faith, and tender heart for all he encountered, Homer practiced the principles he learned in his youth. He wrote that the life that I have chosen gives me my full hours of enjoyment for the balance of my life. The sun will not rise or set without my notice and thanks. On behalf of myself and this gentleman, thank you for coming. I'm happy to take questions now and less formally as we chat over the book signing. And Sue will give me the hook when she feels it's the right moment.
Never.
And I have met several of you, so I know there are going to be some very good questions. But don't make me call on you yet by name. Yes?
Where was the Woodsman's Club in the Adirondacks?
So the North Woods Club is in Minerva, New York. And I realize the Adirondacks aren't that far from here. But the North Woods Club is very different than, for example, the Adirondack League Club or the Au Sable Club. It's 5,000 acres and was never it was always about that size. So there are much larger clubs by acreage, but what the North Woods Club has is about 1,000 of those 5,000 acres are underwater. So it is a fabulous place for a fisherman. And it's not a bad place to go if you like to hunt too. And it is not particularly high. So as an example, around Keene Valley, there are much more dramatic peaks, but it is terrific for fishing. And fishing was something that Winslow Homer loved. And it is, there's something like 25 houses today, and maybe a dozen members who don't have houses but stay in the clubhouse. So it's not very big by membership either, but it was a place that meant a great deal to Winslow Homer. Yes, Jason.
The way that you presented him today, I saw him in a different light than I've ever seen. I mean, I've always looked at his pictures and tried to see what he was trying, the narrative he was trying to create abstractly or just through nature. But I've never identified him as like a naturalist, like Thoreau. Did he identify as like a naturalist? I mean, the way you presented him as someone who's always looking and seeing and perceiving, especially that last quote that you end on, it's like nature and, you know.
So I wish I had tons of diaries to work from. I do have the letters to work from, but this was a man who covered his tracks really well. And so to a great extent, the mosaic portrait is built of tiny fragments, some taken from his letters or his scrapbook, many taken from remarks of people around him, and in some cases from the works of art themselves, which art historians don't like it when I use works of art as documentary evidence. But each of them has its own story. They often have inscriptions, some of them very subtle. The provenance can help tell a story. And so part of what I've been able to do is patiently come to an understanding of him that is based not on what art historians have written in the past, but based on the documentary evidence. And I've tried to be very faithful. As I mentioned to somebody earlier, I was criticized as being too scrupulous, but I was trying to be very faithful to just the facts, man. So, and I'm anticipating this question, so I'm going to address it up front. Many people think of him as a curmudgeon, and I think he was private, I think he was reserved, but I don't think that he disliked people. He had a lot of important friendships, and those friendships had significant impact on him. And so we don't see him ever marrying or ever having children. We don't know of his consummating a sexual relationship with either man or woman, but he was human like all the rest of us, with the same longings that all of us have. And so I've tried in humility to acknowledge the mountains of literature that has been created, primarily about the work rather than the man, and to try to take a fresh look at the man behind the art. I hope that helps. I've also benefited greatly from the hard work of specialists, including one who's here now, John Cromie from Ballston Spa, New York. John has done, and he's here with his wife, Vicki. John, with Vicki's support, has done prodigious work on the legal records related to Prouts Neck land ownership. And so that is itself illuminating. But again, there are lots of small pieces in this mosaic, and I've benefited greatly from the engagement with a number of experts. Thank you, John. Yes.
Did he die wealthy?
He died convinced that he was still poor. He grew up in genteel poverty, and by the time that he made, as an example, the fox hunt, he didn't really need to worry about money anymore, but he always did. He never shed the fear that he grew up with. His older brother was very wealthy and would have covered whatever need he had, but he was proud. And so in the period of the mid to late 80s, when he was in a real slump, he did some pretty bad work just to keep bread on the table, because he was too proud to ask his brother for help. But by the time, so George Innes, who's also represented here in the collection, was, until his death in 1894, regarded by most people as the foremost American landscape painter. And Homer is number 2. When Innes died in 1894, it was too bad for Innes and his family, but it was a good thing for Homer. And pretty quickly, that helped shed more light on Homer, and over the years immediately after that, there were some pretty high prices that people paid for both Homer's work and Ennis's. So he died with a lot of art that had a lot of value, and with a fair amount of property that had value. That doesn't mean that he had a lot of cash sitting in the bank. He didn't. Nor does it mean that he ever got comfortable with his position. And maybe that's part of how he got to be such a great artist right till his dying day. Yes.
Where is the bad work that you speak of? How do you know about it, and how could we know about it?
Yeah. So arguably the single worst painting he ever made, they're not going to like it, but is at the Newark Museum. I don't think they think it's a great painting either, but it was a really important precursor to this absolute masterpiece, Two Guides, which is on the cover of my book. So sometimes people need to do something really bad to figure out something really good. When I said that he did bad work in this 3-year period of a drought in the mid to late 80s, I mean primarily that he did some prints under economic duress for a series called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War. And they are just awful. They're redoing these wonderful field sketches he'd made during the Civil War, and they're completely wooden. And so I think it's interesting to look at very young work, like Feeding the Chickens here in the collection, which is pretty remarkable for an 18-year-old. But it's also interesting to see when somebody who can and does do really great work just has a bad day or a bad year. And Winslow Homer did have that. So if you ever want to feel better about your own failed efforts at draftsmanship, you can look at those Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series.
Do you know
Yes, John?
Do you know if he destroyed work or painted over, those kinds of things?
He did a lot of reworking. So as an example, the Gulf Stream he kept working on. There's a painting in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Institute, which well after they'd bought it, he would go out to Pittsburgh and actually work on it in the gallery. And the Arkell is a beneficiary of his taking a knife to a huge, very ambitious painting, Low Tide, that the reviewers hated, and he decided that they hated it for a reason. And so he created 2 paintings out of one large one and threw away a good chunk of Low Tide. There are several quite important works that he showed and that have disappeared. And you wonder, particularly since even some time ago, major Winslow Homer paintings had significant economic value and would be unlikely to languish forever in somebody's attic. You wonder if maybe he destroyed them. There was a period towards the end of his life where he systematically, and by his own admission, was destroying things that he thought would reflect badly on him, burning them. And there was the son of a local mechanic who pulled some things out of the dump that Homer had put there and failed to burn adequately. So there are some, there's pretty good evidence that he did destroy some work. Yeah. Yes?
Can you speak on why Arkell acquired so many of Homer's paintings?
So Sue may be better at this than I am, but I believe the story is that Bartlett Arkell was a very gifted collector and knew what he liked and was generous in creating this collection for others to enjoy after his death. How am I doing, Sue?
Oh, excellent. And most of our Homers, if not all of them, were acquired directly from the Macbeth Gallery in New York City, where Stephen Clark, down in Cooperstown, also did a lot of shopping. And the Macbeth Gallery acquired most of them directly from the brothers, Charles and Arthur. So we have a terrific family provenance, and as Bill said, Arkell knew what he loved and loved art, and he worked to collect. We have 5 Innises, we have 21 Homers, but he very much wanted to collect American art, but he did know what he liked, and he loved Homer, much to our benefit, so we have a number of them. He bought one of the Adirondack scenes and gave it to the gentleman who founded the Orvis Company, so we're close to the Adirondacks, and we don't have one of those fish.
So, to Sue's point about how he knew what he liked, I think there are 3 color coats watercolors, if I'm not
3 or
mistaken.
4.
Maybe it's 4,
Yeah.
but relatively few of the color coats watercolors focus on men. He was focused primarily on kids and women. And it's interesting that the Arkell's color coats watercolors include one which is on display, which has just one figure, and it's an old man looking out to sea, and another which is a dad, youngish dad, walking over rocks with 2 young children. So those in the whole body of work of color coats, those are kind of unusual, and I think it perhaps reflects Bartlett Arkell's interest in these male figures, that they spoke to him in a way that I'm guessing he could have chosen more typical color coats watercolors, and the one of on the cliffs, of women and children on the cliffs, is more typical, but he chose these rather unusual ones as well. It's kind of interesting.
That may be a good point to take a break so people have the opportunity to see the exhibits. I'd like to thank Bill tremendously. Julia and Jason, we couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much for not only this, but for kicking off what I hope will be a really terrific series of lectures. Bill will be signing books in the back. He will answer questions without signing anything. So you're welcome to chat. And as you said, the 2 Homer watercolors are in the gallery just to the left. All of our oil paintings by Homer are in the Night Watch Gallery, our original gallery at the end of the walkway. So please enjoy. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll come back and see us again.